Who is Celeborn? Is he just a trophy husband for Galadriel, or is there more to him than that? Let's take a look. Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to Deep Geek. On this channel we dive deep into Tolkien's legendarium, as well as the world of A Song of Ice and Fire and The Witcher. Welcome. Celeborn gets very little screen time in the Lord of the Rings films. He's mostly remembered for that one famous line, "Tell me, where is Gandalf? For I much desire to speak with him." And in truth, he generally just stands next to Galadriel as she does cooler things. In the books, though, well, to be honest, many readers would say that in the books he doesn't fare much better on first read, though at least we should probably give him the credit to admit that almost anyone would fade a bit into the background, standing next to the incomparable Galadriel. But still, is there more to him than just co-ruling Lothlorien with her? In digging a bit deeper into his character and history, we should probably start with that oft-used quote from Christopher Tolkien, having gone through all of his father's half-finished stories, essays, papers, and random notes. There is no part of the history of Middle-earth more full of problems than the story of Galadriel and Celeborn. If you read through the chapter devoted to this in Unfinished Tales, you will find that Tolkien changed his mind many times about the backstory of both Galadriel and Celeborn. For now, though, I'll go with the version of the story Christopher Tolkien himself went with, the published version that we find in the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings, though I'll note where there are significant differences. The first difference, unfortunately, comes straight away with Celeborn's birth. The Silmarillion version is that he was a prince of Doriath, the grandnephew of King Thingol, although in another version Tolkien had him as a Teleri elf of Aquilonde, so the other side of the Western Sea. In any event, in both versions of his origin story, in the first age of Middle-earth, Celeborn was residing in Doriath, when Galadriel and her brother Finrod arrived there. Tolkien doesn't use this exact phrase, but reading between the lines, Galadriel is a bit shell-shocked at this moment in time, not wanting to talk about the horrors of what she had just experienced. But she struck up a friendship with Melian the Maya, Queen of Doriath, and we're told that at that time there grew a great love between her and Celeborn, and they married. People often ask why Galadriel fell in love with him. He doesn't come across as being a particular catch for someone like her. Well, who can ever truly understand where and why Cupid's arrow falls, but I think this makes more sense than some imagine. We're told that Galadriel was at that time proud and headstrong, but had been through a lot. One side of her family literally murdering the other, a journey across a frozen hellscape that needlessly cost the lives of many more kinspeople. She needed a bit of peace and people to talk to and just care for her. People who shared her desire to stay in Middle-earth and rule. And Celeborn was there, sharing her vision, being strong and stable and wise. That's actually his moniker, what he was known for, Celeborn the Wise. I suppose in today's language we might say that he was her rock, and they shared a desire to stay in Middle-earth and rule. As we'll see, she continued moving restlessly around Middle-earth in the millennia that followed, sometimes leaving him behind, but she always came back to him. She was the driven, energetic one, and he was the strong and stable one. I guess we all know relationships like that, so perhaps it's not such a weird pairing as it might first look. Anyway, we don't hear much else about the two of them in the period immediately after they married. Finrod, Galadriel's brother, went off to found Nargothrond, and we hear of Galadriel crossing the Blue Mountains away from Morgoth's marauding army later in the First Age. We're not told that Celeborn went with her, so presumably he followed later, because at the start of the Second Age we read in the Silmarillion that the elves were admitted again to the love of Manwë, and the pardon of the Valar, and the Teleri forgave their ancient grief, and the curse was laid to rest. Yet not all of them were willing to forsake the hitherlands, where they had long suffered and long dwelt, and some lingered many an age in Middle-earth. Among these were Círdan the shipwright and Celeborn of Doriath, with Galadriel his wife, who alone remained of those who led the Noldor to exile in Beleriand. There's another inconsistency here, because Tolkien later decided that Galadriel was still explicitly banned from returning to the Undying Lands until she passed the test, the temptation to take the One Ring right at the end of the Third Age. But the important point for us here is that Celeborn could have gone to Valinor, but decided to stay. There's clearly an independence of spirit on show here, as well as a devotion to his wife, and probably also something maybe slightly less edifying, a desire to rule people and lands. In Valinor, he would be quite low down the pecking order, but in Middle-earth, he and Galadriel were mighty. Still, the undisputed king of the elves of the West at the start of the Second Age was Gil-galad, and although some elves set out further east to establish realms beyond his direct rule, Celeborn seems content with Galadriel at first to just linger in Lindon and around Lake Nanuiel. Perhaps it's because they were starting a family at the time and just wanted to nest for a bit. Their daughter Celebrian was born around the year 300 of the Second Age. Their exact movements after that are a little hard to track, as Tolkien changed his mind a few times, but the small family seems to have moved on to Eregion, which was then ruled by Celebrimbor, Galadriel's distant cousin. It was around the year 1200 of the Second Age that Sauron took on the form of Anatar and was welcomed into Eregion, where he taught Celebrimbor the art of making the Rings of Power. We're not told Celeborn's thoughts on the matter, but Galadriel was suspicious and left Eregion, heading through Khazad-dûm with her daughter to the forests beyond. Celeborn did not join her, apparently because of his hatred of dwarves. He didn't want to travel through Khazad-dûm. We see this anti-dwarf sentiment resurface again in The Lord of the Rings many, many years later, when Haldir informs the Fellowship that they may enter Lothlorien, but Gimli, and only Gimli, must be blindfolded. Haldir pointedly says that it's the law of the land and only the master of the law, Celeborn, could set it aside. Respect to Aragorn for finding a workaround that they would all be blindfolded. Needless to say, this is not the nicest part of Celeborn's character, however much it may be grounded in personal pain over what some other dwarves once did in Doriath. Anyway, Galadriel and Celebrian would not return to Celeborn's side for 300 years or so, while Celeborn stayed in Eregion. There's a lot of silence to read into here, but I do wonder whether the couple decided that Galadriel would take their daughter somewhere safe, while Celeborn, who perhaps shared Galadriel's concerns about Anatar, stayed to help out there. Sometime later, Anatar's true identity was revealed as Sauron, the One Ring was forged, and Sauron invaded Eregion. Celeborn was at the forefront of the defence of the realm. He led a sortie out to take on the vanguard of Sauron's army and managed to push them back for a time before sheer weight of numbers told. He and Elrond, who had been sent by Gil-galad to help out, managed to escape with some survivors and founded Rivendell in a secluded valley. Eventually, after Sauron had been pushed back to Mordor, Galadriel ventured back to find her husband, bringing Celebrian, now very much fully grown and her own woman, with her. Celebrian and Elrond fell in love and were married early in the Third Age. Although we might think of Galadriel and Elrond as being close, actually it was Celeborn who probably spent the most time with his future son-in-law. It was only in the year 1981 of the Third Age that Galadriel and Celeborn took on the rulership of Lothlorien, after the death of the previous king, and together they built Canas-Galadhon, that beautiful city in the trees, and there they stayed until the events of The Lord of the Rings. As we noted earlier, Celeborn showed the worst of his character through the laws that singled out dwarves for distrust and mistreatment at Lorien's borders, but he made up for it with his gifts for the Fellowship and contrition when he saw Gimli's heart and knightly love for Galadriel. He asked Gimli to forget his earlier harsh words. We tend to think of the gifts the Fellowship received in Lothlorien as being all about Galadriel, and many of them were. The gifts to Aragorn, Gimli, Frodo and Sam in particular were personal. But we tend to forget that she started out a lot more neutral when it came to offering help or advice. It is Celeborn who explicitly says that the Fellowship shall have whatever aid they need. Perhaps here we see a hint of her subtly taking a lead from him for once. Celeborn starts by wisely offering them boats to travel down the Anduin. They hadn't yet decided which side of the river to continue their journey on, so he would help them keep their momentum while deciding. And he advised them on routes they could take, where they could safely travel to on the river, and so on. Then came the practical gifts, lembas, elven cloaks and rope, and we mustn't forget the full hospitality of Lothlorien, rest, food and recuperation. These may be less attention-grabbing than the File of Galadriel, say, but they were no less useful. Again, I think we're seeing Celeborn's character here, understated and practical. happy not to be in the limelight, but indispensable. We next hear of him a few weeks after the Fellowship leave Lothlorien. Sauron's forces in Dol Guldur attacked Lothlorien 3 times, and after the 3rd time, Celeborn led Lothlorien's forces out on a counterattack into southern Mirkwood and Dol Guldur. Galadriel threw down its walls and purified the forest. Celeborn pushed northwards through the parts that had been overrun by the Shadow all those years, meeting Thranduil halfway. They renamed Mirkwood Erin Lasgallen, the Wood of the Green Leaves, and Celeborn took control of the southern part, naming that East Lorien. There followed a tour of Middle-earth, taking in the wedding of his granddaughter Arwen to Aragorn, a farewell to Treebeard, and some chilled evenings of telepathic chatting with Gandalf, Galadriel, and Elrond. Galadriel, of course, took the ship west a couple of years later with the other ring-bearers, but Celeborn remained in Middle-earth for a while longer. One can only assume that he was overseeing the slow end to the elves' time there, as Lothlorien and Rivendell emptied out and returned to nature. I'm sure he would have liked to have gone with his wife, but there were jobs that still needed doing, so he remained. We're told that in a few years he grew weary of his realm and moved to Rivendell. Then, we don't know exactly when, but certainly no later than the 2nd century of the Fourth Age, he sought out the Grey Havens for himself and Círdan. And the 2 of them took the last ship east. We're told that with their leaving, the last memory of the Elder Days left Middle-earth. So what are we to make of Celeborn? Yes, he is forever in Galadriel's shadow, and his millennia-long hatred of dwarves is a black mark against him, but he was also wise. He was a good fighter and brave, repeatedly standing up to Sauron's forces over the years. He was humble. He could surely have claimed the title of King of Lothlorien or something even more grandiose once Elrond and Galadriel had sailed west, but he stuck to Lord Celeborn. He was loyal and loving to his wife, and seemingly a good ruler. Lothlorien thrived under their joint rule. Celeborn was never the type to want to be in the limelight, and that means that we often overlook his contribution. It was him who took on the vanguard of Sauron's forces in the Second Age. It was him and Elrond who discovered Rivendell, not just Elrond. He co-ruled Lothlorien with Galadriel, and was first to offer aid and gifts to the Fellowship. He seems to have always done what was needed in an unfussy, unshowy way. Not perfect, but stable, strong, humble, and wise. The history of Middle-earth would have been very different but for Celeborn. If you'd like to see more videos breaking down Tolkien's Legendarium in nerdy detail, there's a link to my playlist on the left of your screen. Or to support this channel, thank you. There's a link to my Patreon page on the right of your screen. Thanks for watching. That's all for this time. I'll see you again soon.